This is episode 2 of the Spinoff Success Podcast with Beth Phillips. Welcome to the Spinoff Success Podcast with Beth Phillips. Join me each week for inspiring stories about people leveraging tools, platforms, systems, and skills to create thriving businesses, successful side hustles, and surprising new careers. Tune in to discover whether you have a hidden spinoff success. Hi, this is Beth Phillips. Today I'm talking to Jared Easley. Jared is the co-founder of Podcast Movement, which, if you have heard of it, is probably the most important event for podcasters in the world. And I believe it's the first podcast-only conference. So it's approaching its 5th year. And Jared talks a little bit about executing that conference and how it sort of spun off from his interest in podcasting and the relationships that he built in this medium. So, and we also talk about a few other skills that he could parlay and has parlayed into other successful projects. So take a listen. All right, we are here today with Jared Easley. He is the co-founder of Podcast Movement and a podcaster himself. Jared, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you, Beth, and congratulations on your new show.
Thanks. I'm super excited about it. So before we get into the details of Podcast Movement, do you mind just giving me a little bit of your work background and where you were before you got a little bit ensnared in the world of podcasting?
Well, I lived in one of those families where you don't stay home after 18. Nice. I don't even think that was an option. I don't remember it being an option if it was. So I was out of the house, pretty much right after high school, and tried a number of things. Tried college, what I thought was falling in love. Moving across the country for a girl, which didn't work out, and found myself trying to discover what I should be doing, and ultimately that led to me watching Top Gun, which then had me enlist in the Navy, which maybe that wasn't the right thing to do, but that's what I did. So I ended up in the military, and I had some tough times in the military, but it was also really good structure for me. And when I got out, I was very close to my sister growing up, and she and her family lived in Orlando. They invited me or encouraged me to come down to Orlando and be close to them and figure out what I wanted to do from there. And that's what I did. And that ended up being a smart move because I got into a career path, which was more of the software implementation, project management type of stuff. And I ultimately met my wife, Rachel, who's from South Florida. And so after, a few years of getting to know her, dating her, we got engaged and got married. And so ultimately that led me down to South Florida, where I was working in a 9-to-5 and doing everything correctly. Mm-hmm. I got laid off from that job right before Christmas of 2013. And that was a frustrating time, Beth, because I had done everything right up to that point. I had played the game, so to speak, and clients loved me, and it just finances weren't great in the company or whatever was going on, and so 10 people got let go, and I was one of them. And I remember in that moment it was such a I don't want to be in that scenario again if I can help it. I decided to, instead of getting another full-time job, I decided to take a 1099 contracting role that was somewhat similar to the work I'd already been doing. And that allowed me some flexibility. And from there, I had been listening to podcasts and reading books and learning about business and learning about, different things that are opportunities for people to consider. And so I decided I wanted to test the entrepreneur waters. And I had a series of missteps, Beth. I made some bad choices.
As we all do.
had some, things burn me, like, bad partnership and sure. Just being a rookie. And so it was, I'd love to pretend that, I figured this stuff out pretty quickly, but I didn't. It took probably about 8 years to go from a point where I wanted to try to do something entrepreneurial to January 1st of this year, where my business partner Dan and I, who you know, Dan Franks, where we've actually gone full time with the business that we now run. But that business has been growing and started 5 years ago. But it's been about 8 years from the point when I was like, hey, I think I want to do something on my own, to actually being in that position to do it.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind if I dial back and ask you a few questions. So from when you moved to Orlando, where did you grow up?
I originally grew up in Montgomery, Alabama.
Oh, okay. So hence the Southern accent.
But I lived in a lot of different places. I lived in Texas. I've lived in Tennessee and North Carolina and New England and Hawaii even. And so. And then how old were you when you got out, or when you were got out of the military? When I got out of the military, I believe I was 25.
All right. So you had some experience and yeah. And then I know you started your own podcast between the Navy and starting Podcast Movement. So tell me a little bit about your own podcast.
Well, back when iPods were popular, that's when I really started listening to podcasts. And I just really enjoyed the idea of being able to download something and listen to people talk about it. One of the shows that I really enjoyed was the TV show Lost. The executive producers of that show would talk about each episode, and back then that was like, whoa, that might be more common sort of like now, but
behind the curtain,
yeah, it was absolutely. And I listened to every episode, and they had inside jokes. Like one joke would be a guy named Damon and Carlton were their names, and Damon would bust out this fake. Not a guitar, it was a banjo. I'm sorry. It was he busted out a banjo, but it wasn't actually him. It was just kind of dubbed over, but it was him playing, like pretending like he was playing this banjo. And I know that sounds cheesy, but
not at all.
Like I used to look forward to that every episode. I was like, it's the banjo. And it was so random, but so I got hooked on podcasts, and I decided eventually, hey, I think I want to try this myself, because at the time I didn't enjoy blogging.
Yeah.
I decided talking might be more fun for me, and it took me a long time to start a podcast, Beth, because I thought it was going to be really expensive, and I thought I wasn't going to be creative enough, or I wasn't going to be entertaining enough, and that I just had a lot of self-doubt, ironically. So
let me stop you, though. Like, back then, it couldn't have been as easy as it is now.
There was...
I mean, it had to be a little bit more expensive for equipment. There were probably fewer resources online about how to start one. So I give you so much credit for just like finding the resources to figure out how to do it as far back as you did.
Well, I appreciate that. It was as hard as I made it, I guess. So, but the point was I could have started much sooner, and I delayed. And I hope that's a takeaway for people listening is, don't delay if you can help it. I mean, be like Beth and jump in the deep end and go for it.
Oh, no. So. Like, I think most of us have been thinking about something we want to do and take years and years for it to, finally happen, or something to push you over the edge. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think pushed you over the edge to finally just jump in and start one? So when did Starve the Doubts, that your podcast, officially launch?
It's been...
Because I know I've been listening probably since, I want to say 2014?
Yeah, I believe 2013 was when it started. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's what, 6 years now? That's pretty wild to think about that, actually.
It really is. Yeah, you're almost like, you're not a granddaddy, but you're a daddy.
Well, I know that not everything's been perfect in that process, but I've enjoyed it, and I've made a lot of good friends, and that in and of itself was more than worth doing it. So
yeah, for sure. And so then once you had this podcast, what made you decide to spin off into a conference? I mean, did you major in event planning and podcast conference planning?
Not at all. What happened was a person that I admired and respected had a conference in Dallas, and I was going to attend that conference. I wanted to have a community meetup outside of that conference, but I didn't feel like my audience, which was pretty new at that time, was big enough that I could just go to a different city like Dallas and say, hey, come hang out with me. So what I decided was it might be a better idea to have a co-host, someone who's already in Dallas and maybe has friends and a network already there. So I was listening to a show called Entrepreneur Showdown, and that is hosted or co-hosted by Dan Franks.
Oh yeah.
And I didn't know Dan personally. I had become familiar with his podcast. So I reached out to him and said, hey, I'm going to be in town for this conference, and I was thinking about doing a meetup. Would you guys, him and a gentleman named Joe, would you like to work together and do a community meetup? And they were up for it. They had never done that either. So we put together a meetup, invited people that we knew. I had some friends in Dallas, and of course they invited their network, and we ended up having a nice meetup. It was about 25 people, and to me that was like, wow, this is really cool. We were able to pull this off. And we had never met till the night of doing that meetup. So long story short, the meetup led to some other opportunities, led to Dan and I going to another event in Vegas, and that's where we got the idea for Podcast Movement.
Really? In that short of time, 2 conferences and 1 meetup?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little more to it, but we attended an event called New Media Expo. It was in Las Vegas, and a majority of the attendees at that particular conference were podcasters, although that conference wasn't focused for podcasting. It had a track that was dedicated to podcasting, but the conference overall is for bloggers and for video people and for podcasting and for a lot of folks. But the majority of the attendees were podcasters. And I remember hearing people say, why isn't there a conference just for podcasters? And at that time, there wasn't anything. There's some options now, but there wasn't then. And Dan and I looked at each other and said, this is the market saying what it wants.
Yeah.
maybe we could be the people to try to put that together. And that was a little bit naive, Beth, because we didn't have a large following. We didn't have a large connection network, so to speak. We had friends that were podcasters, but we didn't have an email list or anything. So we basically decided to try a crowdfunding campaign, and the whole reason for that was to validate the idea. We didn't have money to lose on trying to create an event that nobody wanted. So we decided if people were serious about a podcasting event, we'll create this crowdfunding campaign, and if it's supported, then that'll be enough validation to continue. We reached out to friends and said, hey, this is what we're doing. Will you help us? Will you speak at it? Will you share it with your network? Will you support it? And yeah, we put together a campaign. We're saying hopefully we could raise at least $10,000, and maybe that would be enough to have a small, little event.
Local meetup.
We weren't thinking too
That's
big
crazy.
at that time. We raised $10,000 in the first day of that. that was on Valentine's Day. I'll never forget it.
I remember it too. I remember when you announced it.
It just blew my mind that happened. And then you fast forward the 30 days, we got over 3 times what we needed for that crowdfunding campaign. So then it was off to the races, just asking questions, getting feedback from people we knew, and a lot of trial by fire. And just a few months after that, we put on our first event. It wasn't perfect, but it was about 3 times larger than we thought the original event, or we're hoping that would be. So we had over 600 people at that first event.
Yeah.
And then it was just, okay, let's keep doing this. And, that sounds like a happy story, but there was a couple years in the beginning there where we worked full-time jobs. We had family responsibilities and made absolutely nothing or lost money trying to figure this out. And so while it was kind of this, sounds like this success story, it was it was a lot of learning.
5 years at this point in the making, but I'm going to dial back and take you back because, I'm totally challenging you that like you kind of gloss over the fact that you did a Kickstarter, which I don't think you appreciate how intimidating even that step is for people because it's an unfamiliar platform. People aren't sure like what the setup is, what the ramifications tax-wise are. There are a lot of considerations, so I'm giving you credit for that.
Thank you.
And so, you have expertise in that right now. because you did a really successful one. You marketed it, because I had never heard of you before you guys launched it. I had never heard of your podcast. Somehow I heard of this. So you successfully marketed this Kickstarter. I contributed to it, even though I didn't have a podcast. I loved podcasts, so I didn't know. And I bought a ticket, couldn't attend. I bought a ticket for the next year, couldn't attend, and I didn't care. I just was so there's something to be said for that. So as many, bumps, you guys learned and executed really well over these past 5 years. So I just want to give you credit for that.
Well, thank you. And I wouldn't dare assume that, this is all on me. Dan, my business partner, he was relentless, and I got to really give a lot of credit to him too. So, but yeah, thank you, Beth. I mean, you've been a big supporter, and it couldn't have happened without a lot of folks just believing in it. And
Let me ask you.
I don't know how it happened, but
you know what? How do you continue to justify it to your respective families when it's thankless? There is no money coming in. It takes so much time away from your growing families. How do you continue to justify it? Practically speaking.
Late nights. There was a lot of conversations. Is this worth it? And I would always make sure to bring my wife and my daughter to the events. So even when they weren't providing for us, they could see that this was not a foolish endeavor.
Cool.
There was, there was people,
people behind it who believed in it. And
absolutely.
Yeah, because I have seen those pictures too.
Yeah, to let my wife see that, and even my mother-in-law, let her come and experience it, and to see for themselves. Mm-hmm. Hey, there's really awesome things that are happening, and it's not a foolish pie in the sky dream. Like, there is something here. We just need to continue to be wise about how we go about it.
Yeah,
and that helped. So when it was kind of those difficult seasons, they'd be able to see those groups of people at the event, and it was a little bit of a reassurance. But yeah, that was a tough time, Beth, because sometimes you got to be the only one to believe in yourself when other people aren't sure. Because it's kind of funny when things aren't like perfect and you're not doing great. A lot of folks will write you off as, this person's crazy, or this person's making a bad decision. But when you are successful, or you do have something that works, then all of a sudden you're a genius. So
right.
you can't have
Nobody
it both
sees
ways.
the behind the scenes. But you know what? The other thing I kind of remember about it in the early days is you guys got some super big names. Like, I think Pat Flynn was at the first one, Jeff Brown, Srini Rao. I mean, I can't remember. And then like at the second and third one, Mark Maron. And how was that? Just relentless contact and putting out your feelers? And how did you do that?
The first year, it was really just begging, and just people were gracious, and we had a rapport with some of the folks that you named.
Mm-hmm.
We had connected with them. We'd had them guests on podcast episodes, and in some cases, I had actually worked with those folks, setting up meetups for them at other conferences. And so there was a rapport that was already there. It wasn't like a cold ask. There was a lot of connection prior to getting to that point. And then the following year, you mentioned Mark Maron. The story behind that is we had been advertising that particular year on Facebook, and Glenn Beck saw our ad, and he is based in Dallas-Fort Worth. And so he had reached out to us about speaking at Podcast Movement. And at the time we thought, well, that could be a good idea. Even though he's controversial to some, there's a lot that could, be learned from someone who's left a major network and then gone and created something, like the Blaze online. And I'm sure podcasters could learn from that. That was our mindset. So we announced Glenn Beck, and we thought that was a big deal. Like, here's a big name. And a lot of people were not happy with us for doing that.
Yeah, you got so much backlash.
Yeah, there was actually a lot of backlash. And so we had to navigate that. Mm-hmm. And what ultimately happened is Glenn Beck had some type of illness. I don't remember. It was maybe has something to do with his vocal cords, or I don't remember exactly what it was. But he ended up having to drop out, and it was maybe less than a month before the event.
Yeah, I kind of remember.
So it was So it was kind of like, oh, we need to,
fill the void.
yeah, and we could have easily said, okay, well, we've crunched the numbers, and we're just not in a position to, pay someone big to come in and do this. And Dan and I agreed, let's really try to swing for the fences here. Let's set a good reputation for the event. Let's try to get someone that people will know. And Mark Maron had just interviewed President Obama
Right.
in his garage, and that was a big story for podcasters. And so we were able to figure out a way to get in touch with his people and did some negotiations, and
That's
we
awesome.
had to. Yeah, we had to make a big decision, and we decided that let's, that is an uncomfortable number, but let's try to figure that out, and we just went for it. And I think
awesome.
now in retrospect, that was the right decision, even though it was a difficult decision, because it kind of set the tone for future events. Like, people believed that, hey, this is
the credibility of the whole event. Yeah.
that was a big sacrifice for us that year. So much so that when we did the math at the end of that event, we were 40,000 in the hole. And I'll never forget that. That was a very stressful time. So,
I can believe it.
so yeah, that was a costly decision, but we survived it. And just had some mountains and some valleys in that time.
Right. Let me ask you about one of what I consider another of your spinoff talents is you host a lot of meetups and workshops locally, and then you'll travel for them. Is that accurate?
We usually try to lump it in with something that we're already doing.
Okay.
So it's never just to do it. It's usually more strategic than that. So last week we attended an event in San Diego, and because we're going to be there anyway, we decided, hey, let's try to have a community meetup.
Okay.
And so that's usually what we do.
But
So
do
if we
you
know,
host like a local meetup where you are in South Florida pretty regularly?
I have in the past,
Mhm.
and I don't currently do it, Beth. And the main reason for that is the bandwidth. I just it was becoming a successful
work
meetup,
then.
and it was growing, and it was, but it was just a labor of love. It was kind of like a podcast. It was just something I was doing for free, just to try to get the local folks together, and that became just too much on top of everything else, and family and podcast movement and day
Sure.
job stuff.
Yeah, but it is a skill
sacrifice
nonetheless
that.
to have, successfully done that and then said, this isn't, worth the sacrifice, and I gotta, sort of weigh my benefits versus, drawbacks.
Yeah,
or whatever.
I had a couple people kind of raise their hand saying, "Here, let me run this," but the people that were raising their hand were folks that were trying to use that group to their business advantage,
Right.
rather than just trying to foster a community.
Yeah.
So it ended up dying, and that part was kind of sad. But at the same time, I realized, no, we're gonna move forward here, and we had a good meetup that people connected, and those friendships are still there. And
That's awesome.
at some point, maybe someone else comes along and starts another meetup, and I'll be happy to support it. But yeah, I don't regret it. I did what I could.
Okay, and I am the beneficiary of. I'm a huge reader, and I've read both of the books that you published. So I'm really interested to ask. This is another spin-off skill that you have. Are you working on any publishing projects currently?
Not currently. I've had a dozen ideas for publishing projects, but I've agreed with Dan to be really laser focused on podcast movement right now.
It does take so much,
So
effort.
once we kind of get, in a, I won't say better position, but we've got a few more systems in place and things, I probably will attempt to tackle another book. But yeah, for right now, I've decided I'm going to deliberately wait. And yeah, I get the itch every now and then to start typing. I'm not preventing myself, but I'm still doing writing. Like, we have a weekly newsletter, and I usually write those rough drafts. And
By
we just
do
did
you
this.
mean you and Dan? Or
Well, I'll do the rough draft, and Dan usually puts his blessing on it, so to
you
speak.
guys are a good team.
Finesses it.
Yeah, your
Yeah,
newsletters,
absolutely.
or at least what I got through the challenge, are really excellent.
Yeah, that's another example. So the challenge, we did 28 emails there, and you know, maybe they're not perfect, but that was an exercise of sitting down and thinking, how do we disseminate this information and in a way that's not going to overwhelm people and try to make it simple. And I feel like it did a reasonable job at that, at least for the
You
first
did an
round.
excellent job. I was really surprised and impressed at how specific, actionable, and organized it was. It was very clear that you guys really thought about each of the steps and maybe decided to de-emphasize certain things just for the sake of completion. And
Right.
I cannot emphasize how impressed I was by
Thank
each of
you.
those emails. They were entertaining, informative, actionable. They had like really relevant links. So you guys did a great job with that. And that in itself, that content is gold. And I hope you you guys do something with it. I think I've told you
Well,
both that.
yeah, Dan and I were talking last week in San Diego, and we're like, hey, we were very pleased with the 28-day challenge, and we're going to continue it. So right now, we're still debating on exactly how that's going to roll out, but
Yeah.
we are going to plan to do it again.
Oh,
And
you
we
really
feel like it's
should.
definitely something that's helping people, and that's worth it.
Yeah, so I think I've probably bothered you about 3 or 4 of your spinoff skills and successes. Do you have anything in the works that might surprise us, or any skills that you think particularly have helped you make these things a success?
I think attempting to, um, as silly as it sounds, just be kind to people, be patient, be friendly. I think that really goes a long way. Sometimes that doesn't scale, or people will think that doesn't scale, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be kind or take time to connect. And so I try to do that. And I'm not perfect at it, but I think that has really been a blessing and something that's helped us grow is always attempting to try to foster relationships and, have those meaningful interactions. And that's why we do the meetups. That's why
Yeah.
we, try to go to these different events. That's why we try to, have things like the 28-day challenge. And we do that because we want to generously connect and, in our own way, show people that, we're trying to have a good community and do things that benefit a group of people. And yeah, so, and it's not always that one-on-one coffee. Sometimes it's a meetup like we talked about, but, doing
Yeah.
that is better than nothing. So,
Well, you know what I think, and I can sort of speak for myself because I really have um, just been introduced to you. I was 5 years ago, just from this project that you were doing, and your graciousness and your generosity is really compounding. It's very genuine, and that it's really intangible, but I do think that it compounds and pays off in ways that you don't expect. Um, so I actually have a list of all the skills that I think that you have successfully spun off, if you don't mind if I read them.
before you say that, I'm going to tell you, I've also dealt with bitterness and frustration and a number of other qualities that aren't wonderful. So,
Oh, yeah, but that's
I
part
want to
of
make
it.
sure that people understand that.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure that you do. But do you mind if I read this list?
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
curious.
so because I'm hoping to, if somebody says, "Oh, I could do that," that it inspires them to do something. And I think you've really just executed so well on whatever skills that you have learned either in the military or through podcasting or through connecting. So you have learned how to successfully start a Kickstarter, how to run an event, how to connect with people, how to communicate, how to write a book, how to just the continuous publication of your podcast is super impressive. I mean, what has it been, 5 years?
Yep.
That's crazy. Um, you consult. We didn't even get into that. I have heard you on other podcasts talking about your consulting business. You're a successful meetup host, a workshop host, social media influencer, internet marketer, public speaker. You're great at interviewing. You're great at listening. You're great at communication. Not to mention all the software and platforms that you successfully leverage. You're very impressive.
Well, thank you, Beth.
So
I am humbled. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, and I cannot wait. I hope I meet you in Philadelphia.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's going to happen for sure.
Yep. Well, thanks for everything, Jared, and we'll connect soon.
Yeah, and I'm proud of you. This is a big step, and I'm excited for your show. So, I'm rooting for you. I hope you continue to do well with it.
Oh, thanks. Thanks so much to Jared for giving us some inside scoop on what it takes to pull off a super successful conference. You can connect with Jared on Twitter. He's pretty active on Twitter and really is intentional about reaching out. You can find him at Jared Easley. Also, if you want to follow what Podcast Movement is doing, you can. It has its own Twitter handle at Podcast Movement. You can also find out more information about the conference at podcastmovement.com. And I encourage you also to listen to Jared's podcast called Starve the Doubts. You can find that on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. Thanks for listening. I have some cool guests lined up in the next couple of weeks, so if you don't want to miss them, be sure to subscribe on iTunes. I'll see you next time.